Year 1200 something. There's no sun in the sky yet. No birds singing. Just darkness. Thick, heavy, medieval darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, a person is about to wake up. Not because they want to. Not because they had a nice dream and feel refreshed. No, they're waking up because their body is cold. Really, really cold. There's no heating in this world. No radiator humming in the corner. No little dial you can turn up. If you were sleeping in a medieval home, whether you were a peasant in a one-room cottage or a slightly fancier person in a slightly fancier house, the cold got in. It didn't ask permission. It just showed up, curled around your feet, and stayed there all night like an uninvited guest who never leaves. And here's the thing. Most homes back then didn't even have glass in the windows. Glass was expensive. It was a luxury item, like something you'd brag about at a party if parties involved bragging about windows. Which, actually, they kind of did. Rich folks loved showing off their glass. But for most people, their windows were just holes. Holes in the wall, sometimes covered with a wooden shutter, sometimes stuffed with cloth or straw to keep some of the wind out, sometimes just open, just a hole, letting the cold night air pour in like it owned the place. So imagine trying to sleep like that. No proper insulation, no double-glazed anything. Just you, a thin layer of something that might generously be called a blanket, and the great outdoors basically sitting right next to you in spirit, if not in actual physical presence. Well, sometimes in actual physical presence too. Small animals like to sneak in. Mice. The occasional bird if the hole was big enough. Nobody was checking IDs at the door. Now let's talk about waking up. This wasn't your gentle modern wake-up, where a soft alarm slowly gets louder, or your body just naturally rises because it got 8 hours of quality rest. This was different. This was waking up because your nose feels like an ice cube, because your breath is turning into little clouds above your face, because some part of you, maybe your feet, maybe your hands, has gone slightly numb, and your brain is sending out a very simple, very urgent message. Cold, cold, cold. Move. Now. And moving was not fun, because the moment you moved, the moment you peeled back whatever you were using as a blanket, that first blast of open air hit you like a slap. A rude, uninvited, very effective wake-up call. There was no lying in bed for 20 more minutes scrolling on a phone. There was no snooze button. The cold itself was the alarm, and it did not believe in second chances. Let's think about the actual air in these homes too. Even indoors, the temperature could dip close to freezing during winter months, especially in the hours right before dawn, which is exactly when most people were expected to start their day. That's right, the coldest part of the whole 24 hours, and that's when it was time to get up. Whoever designed this system clearly hated mornings just as much as the rest of us. And it wasn't just about being cold. It was about being cold in the dark. No light bulbs. No little night light glowing softly in the corner. If you wanted light before sunrise, you needed fire. And fire needs fuel, and fuel needs to be gathered. And none of that was going to happen while you were still lying there, shivering, trying to convince your legs to function. So for those first few minutes of being awake, you were just there, in the dark, in the cold, fully conscious, fully miserable, and fully aware that the day had not even technically started yet. There's something almost funny about it, if you squint. This idea that we complain today about our alarm clocks, about how loud they are, how annoying, How we wish we could sleep 5 more minutes. Meanwhile, this medieval person's alarm clock was literally just the temperature of the room, slowly making their life unbearable. No snooze, no volume control, just cold, patient, and extremely effective. And once you were up, that first tiny bit of movement, actually sitting up, actually swinging your legs out from whatever warmth you'd managed to build up overnight, that was already an accomplishment. That was already the hardest part of the day for some people, and the day hadn't even really begun. There was no coffee waiting, no warm shower to ease you into consciousness, just cold air, cold floor, maybe a cold stone floor if you were extra unlucky, and the quiet realization that yes, this is happening. Yes, it's time to be a person now. It's easy to romanticize the past sometimes. People love saying things like, oh, life was simpler back then. And sure, maybe in some ways it was. But simple doesn't always mean nice. Simple can also mean cold, dark, and deeply uncomfortable before you've even had a chance to fully open your eyes. There was no gentle transition into the day, no easing in, just straight from unconscious to freezing, with nothing soft in between. So the next time your alarm goes off and you groan a little, just remember, at least it's not the temperature of the room doing the waking up for you. At least you probably have a blanket that was made this century. At least there's most likely glass in your windows, keeping the wind exactly where it belongs, which is outside, far away from your face. The medieval morning didn't start with comfort. It started with survival. And that, right there, before a single chore was done, before a single task was started, was already the first small victory of the day. Just getting up, just facing the cold, just beginning. And from there, the day only got more interesting. Because once you were up, cold, and slightly grumpy, there was still the matter of that bed you just crawled out of. And let's just say, it had a few surprises of its own. Okay, so you're awake. You're cold. You've survived that first brutal moment of consciousness. Now let's talk about the thing you were actually lying on, because honestly, it deserves its own little chapter of shame. When we say bed, in the medieval world, we are not talking about a mattress. We are not talking about memory foam or springs or anything that gently contours to your body while you sleep. No, for most people, a bed was a sack. Just a big fabric sack stuffed with straw. Sometimes it was called a straw tick, which sounds like a bug, but is actually just the name for this stuffed sack situation. And straw, if you've never had the pleasure, is not soft. It's scratchy. It's lumpy. And after a few weeks of sleeping on it every night, it starts to flatten out and clump up in all the wrong places, kind of like a couch cushion that's given up on life. If you were a little better off, maybe you got chaff instead of straw. Chaff is the leftover husks from threshing grain, and it was considered a slight upgrade because it was a bit softer. A bit. We're not talking luxury here. We're talking the difference between sleeping on gravel and sleeping on slightly smaller gravel. And if you were wealthy, well, then maybe you got feathers. A feather bed, which sounds nice, and honestly, it kind of was, relatively speaking. But feather beds were expensive, and most people never touched one in their entire lives. For the average medieval person, straw was just the standard, the norm, the thing everybody complained about, but nobody could really do anything about. Now here's where it gets a little less charming. These straw sacks were not exactly cleaned very often, and straw, sitting there night after night, absorbing sweat and warmth and body heat, becomes a very cozy little apartment complex for bugs. Fleas loved it. Lice loved it. Bedbugs, if we're being honest, probably loved it most of all. So when you climbed into bed at night, you weren't just getting into a bed. You were getting into a shared living situation with a whole ecosystem of tiny uninvited roommates who had absolutely no intention of paying rent. People did try to deal with this. There are records of folks stuffing their mattresses with herbs like mint or wormwood, hoping the smell would keep the bugs away. Sometimes it helped a little. Sometimes it just meant you were getting bitten by fleas while also smelling faintly of a herb garden. A small win, I suppose. Now let's talk about who you were sleeping next to. Because in a lot of medieval homes, especially peasant homes, there wasn't a separate bedroom for everyone. Sometimes the whole family shared one bed. Parents, kids, maybe a grandparent squeezed in somewhere. Space was tight, houses were small, and privacy just wasn't really a concept that existed the way we think of it today. If you wanted personal space in medieval times, honestly, good luck. That dream was not happening. And it wasn't just family sometimes. In some homes, animals slept close by too. Not always in the same bed, thankfully, but often in the same room, or right on the other side of a thin wall. Chickens, maybe a goat, sometimes even a cow, all sharing the same general living space as the humans. Partly this was for warmth. Animals give off body heat, and in a freezing cold house with no real insulation, every little bit helped. So in a strange way, that goat wasn't just a farm animal. It was basically an early, extremely smelly space heater. Let's also mention the actual bed frame, if there even was one. A lot of poorer homes just had the straw sack sitting directly on the floor. No frame, no elevation, just straw, floor, and whatever cold was seeping up from below. If you were slightly better off, maybe you had a simple wooden frame, raising you up a bit, which helped with drafts and dampness. But even then, we are still talking about something incredibly basic. No springs, no cushioning, just wood and straw and a prayer that you'd wake up without too many new bug bites. Blankets were their own adventure too. Wool was the go-to material, since it was what most people had access to. But wool blankets could be scratchy, heavy, and honestly not always great at actually keeping you warm once they got a little worn out. Some people layered on extra clothing just to sleep, wearing basically the same outfit to bed that they'd wear the next day, minus maybe the outer layer. Which, when you think about it, does save time in the morning. Silver lining. So when you put it all together, the medieval bed was cold, scratchy, shared with bugs, possibly shared with a farm animal on the other side of the wall, and offered basically zero privacy. And yet, somehow, people slept in these conditions night after night, year after year, and just accepted it. Because that was life. That was normal. Nobody was out here comparing mattress reviews. It really does put things in perspective. Next time your blanket feels a little scratchy, or your pillow's a bit lumpy, just remember, at least there's no goat on the other side of your wall. At least the bugs, hopefully, stayed outside where they belong. And once that bed was finally left behind for the day, there was still the matter of figuring out what time it even was. Because in a world with no clocks, no phones, and no alarms, telling time was its own strange little puzzle. So, no clocks, no phones, no little glowing numbers telling you exactly what time it is. If you woke up in the middle of the night in medieval times and wondered, hey, what time is it right now? The honest answer was nobody really knew. Not precisely, anyway. Time back then wasn't something you checked. It was something you sort of felt your way through, like fumbling around a dark room looking for a light switch that doesn't exist yet. For most regular people, the day didn't start with a number. It started with light, or more accurately, the promise of light. That thin gray glow creeping in before the sun actually showed up. That was basically it. That was the signal. Not a beep, not a buzz. Just the sky slowly deciding it was ready to stop being pitch black. And yes, roosters were involved. This part is actually true, not just something people say for fun. Roosters really do start crowing before sunrise, and in a lot of villages, that crowing became the unofficial start of the day. It wasn't precise. It wasn't scientific. It was just a loud, feathery creature yelling into the darkness, and everyone nearby sort of groaning and accepting that yes, apparently, it's morning now, according to the bird. Can you imagine relying on a rooster as your only alarm clock? No snooze button, no turning it off, just an animal, somewhere outside, screaming with total confidence, whether or not it was actually the right time. Because here's the thing, roosters aren't always accurate. Sometimes they crow early, sometimes a little later. Sometimes, honestly, they just feel like crowing in the middle of the night for reasons only known to the rooster. So this whole system people relied on wasn't exactly reliable. It was more like a suggestion, a loud, feathery suggestion. Now, for people who needed a bit more structure, there was the church. Bells, specifically. Church bells played a huge role in medieval daily life, and not just for religious services. They were basically the community clock. Monasteries in particular had very strict schedules, ringing bells at specific points through the day and night for prayer times. These were called the canonical hours, and they had lovely, old-timey names like matins, which happened crazy early, sometimes literally in the middle of the night, and lauds, which came around dawn. For monks, this meant an extremely disrupted sleep schedule, waking up in the dark to pray, going back to bed for a bit, then waking up again not long after for more prayer. Basically the medieval version of jet lag, except nobody was going anywhere. Just constant interruption, all in the name of devotion. For regular villagers, though, church bells served a slightly more practical purpose. They let everyone in the area know roughly what part of the day it was. Not the exact minute, nothing like that, but enough. Enough to know, okay, it's about time to start heading to the fields. Or, okay, that's the midday bell, time for a short break. The bells created a shared rhythm for the whole community, even though nobody actually knew if it was, say, 6:47 or 6:52. Nobody cared about that kind of precision. Life just didn't require it. And here's something interesting. The actual length of an hour wasn't even fixed the way we think of it today. In a lot of medieval timekeeping systems, daylight hours were divided into 12 equal parts, no matter how long the day actually was. Which means an hour in summer, when days are long, was actually longer than an hour in winter, when days are short. So technically, hours themselves kind of stretched and shrank depending on the season, which sounds confusing, and honestly, it kind of was. Nobody was pulling out a stopwatch to double check. For farmers and peasants, though, none of this super mattered much anyway. Their days weren't really run by hours at all. They were run by tasks and by the sun. Wake up around dawn, work until the light started fading, and everything in between just sort of happened as it happened. There wasn't a rigid 9 to 5. There was just morning stuff, midday stuff, and evening stuff, all loosely guided by where the sun happened to be sitting in the sky. Sundials existed too, for what it's worth, though they weren't exactly common in most peasant homes. They were more of a public or wealthy household thing. And obviously, sundials have one small design flaw. They don't work at night, or on cloudy days, which, if you've ever experienced actual weather, happens quite a lot. So even sundials, fancy as they were, weren't exactly dependable. So basically, the whole medieval approach to time was kind of a loose, communal guessing game. A rooster here, a church bell there, the general vibe of the sky. Nobody was stressing about being 5 minutes late, because nobody really had a way of knowing what 5 minutes even meant in the grand scheme of the day. It's kind of nice, in a strange way. No pressure of exact minutes. No frantic glancing at a clock. Just light, sound, and a general sense of, yeah, it's probably time to get moving now. Of course, it also meant there was no snoozing your way out of it. Once that rooster started up, or those bells began ringing, that was it. The day had officially, unofficially begun. And once people were up and moving, the very first task waiting for them wasn't food, or washing, or anything particularly pleasant. It was fire. Because without fire, absolutely nothing else in the day was going to happen. All right, you're up. You've survived the cold. You've crawled out of your bug-friendly straw bed. And somewhere out there, a rooster is very proud of itself. Now what? Well, before anything else could happen in a medieval home, before breakfast, before chores, before basically anything, there was one job that had to come first. Fire. See, fire wasn't just a nice little bonus back then. It wasn't like today, where you flip a switch and boom, warmth, light, done. Fire was everything. It was your heat. It was your light. It was how you cooked. It was how you boiled water to make it safe enough to drink. Without fire, you were sitting in a cold, dark house with basically no way to prepare food or stay warm. So yeah, fire had to happen first, no negotiating. Now, the good news is, most households didn't have to start a fire completely from scratch every single morning. That would have been miserable and honestly kind of dangerous, depending on the method. Instead, the trick was something called banking the fire. Basically, before going to bed at night, someone in the house would cover the hot embers with ash. Just enough ash to smother the flame, but not so much that it killed the heat completely. Kind of like tucking the fire in for the night, wrapping it in a cozy little ash blanket so it could survive till morning. Then, when someone woke up, their job was to carefully uncover those embers, add a little kindling, maybe blow on it gently, coax it back to life. If you did it right, you'd have a fire going again fairly quickly. If you did it wrong, or if the embers had died out overnight, well, that was a whole different kind of morning. That meant starting from actual scratch. Flint and steel, striking sparks onto some dry material like charred cloth or dried moss, and hoping, praying, that a spark caught before your fingers went completely numb from the cold. This is honestly a very stressful way to start a day. Imagine your entire household's comfort and ability to eat depends on you successfully striking a spark with a rock and a piece of metal while your hands are freezing, in the dark, before the sun's even fully up. No pressure or anything. And once the fire was going, that wasn't really the end of the job either. It needed feeding. Constantly. Wood, mostly, though in some areas people used peat, which is this dense, compressed turf that burns slower but works in a pinch, especially in places without a lot of forests around. Gathering fuel for the fire wasn't a one-time thing. It was a daily task, sometimes involving walking a fair distance to collect wood, then hauling it back, then chopping it down to a usable size, all before you'd even eaten anything. Now let's talk about where this fire actually was, because this part is kind of rough. In a lot of medieval peasant homes, there was no chimney. None. The fire was just built in a central hearth, right there on the floor, and the smoke was expected to, I guess, figure itself out. Sometimes there was a small hole in the roof to let some of it escape. Sometimes there wasn't even that, which means the inside of these homes was often filled with smoke, day after day, year after year. You can probably guess what that does to a person's lungs over time. Chronic coughing, respiratory problems, eye irritation, all of it was just sort of considered normal. Not fun, not healthy, but normal. Nobody was walking around thinking, wow, my house is basically a smokehouse, and that's probably bad for me. It was just how things were. The alternative, no fire at all, was so much worse that the smoke became one of those problems people just learned to live with. Chimneys did exist, eventually, especially in wealthier homes as the medieval period went on. But for a huge chunk of the population, for a huge chunk of medieval history, smoke just hung in the air, slowly working its way out through whatever gaps it could find. Thatched roofs actually helped a little here, believe it or not, since smoke rising up would sort of seep through the thatch over time, which is a nice little silver lining, though probably small comfort if you were coughing your way through breakfast. And speaking of that hearth, it wasn't just for warmth. It was the kitchen too. Pots would hang over the fire or sit on stones right beside it, slowly cooking whatever the family had for the day. So this one small fire, sitting in the middle of a smoky room, was doing basically all the heavy lifting. Heat, light, cooking, all from one source, all requiring constant attention and constant fuel. So by the time that fire was finally crackling away properly, whoever got it going had already done a decent chunk of physical work before the sun had even fully risen. Gathering kindling, striking sparks, maybe hauling in wood from outside in the freezing cold, all while their eyes were probably still adjusting to being awake at all. It's kind of wild to think about, honestly. Something we do without even thinking, just flipping a switch for heat or light, used to be this whole physical, smoky, slightly dangerous production. And once that fire was finally going, there was still the matter of water. Because a fire's great, but it doesn't do much good without something to cook or boil, and getting that water was its own entire journey. Okay, so the fire's going. Nice. Warmish. Smoky, but warmish. Now you need water. And here's the thing about water in medieval times. It didn't come from a tap. There was no faucet you could just walk over to and turn on. If you wanted water, for drinking, for cooking, for literally anything, you had to go get it yourself. Every single day. For most people, this meant a walk. Sometimes a short one, if you were lucky enough to live near a well or a stream. Sometimes a much longer one, if the nearest water source happened to be further out. And this wasn't a leisurely little stroll either. This was carrying heavy buckets, usually two of them, often balanced on a wooden yoke across your shoulders, because carrying 2 buckets by hand the whole way is a great way to end up with permanently lopsided arms. And water, it turns out, is heavy, really heavy. A single gallon weighs around 8 pounds, and most households needed a fair amount of it just to get through a day of cooking, drinking, and basic cleaning. So we're talking multiple trips, multiple heavy loads, carried by hand or shoulder, first thing in the morning, before you'd really had a chance to properly wake up. This job often fell to women and children in medieval households, which meant that before the sun had even fully risen, someone was already out there trudging to the well, filling buckets, and trudging back, arms aching, shoulders sore, all before breakfast had even been thought about. Kind of makes your morning coffee run feel pretty easy in comparison, honestly. Now here's where things get a little less pleasant. That water you were hauling back? It wasn't exactly what we'd call clean. Wells could be contaminated. Streams could be contaminated. Sometimes the water source was uncomfortably close to where waste was being disposed of, which, yeah, is exactly as unpleasant as it sounds. There wasn't really an understanding yet of germs or bacteria or why drinking certain water could make you sick. People just knew, from experience, that some water made you feel fine, and some water made you feel very much not fine. This is actually a big part of why beer and ale were such a massive part of medieval daily life. Not because everyone was constantly trying to get a little tipsy, but because the brewing process, boiling the water, the alcohol content, actually made it safer to drink than plain water in a lot of cases. So people, including children, would often drink a weaker, lower alcohol version of ale throughout the day, not for fun, but basically as a safer hydration option. Imagine that. Kids drinking ale for breakfast, not because anyone thought it was a great parenting choice, but because it was genuinely one of the more reliable options available. Milk was another option, when available, though it obviously didn't keep well without refrigeration, so that came with its own set of risks too. Basically, staying hydrated in a safe way was its own quiet daily challenge, something people had to think about constantly, in a way most of us never have to today. And let's go back to that walk to the well for a second, because it wasn't just physically tiring, it was also kind of a whole social event. Wells and streams were common gathering points, especially for women, and a lot of daily gossip, news, and community bonding actually happened right there, buckets in hand, waiting for a turn to draw water. So in a strange way, the well was sort of the medieval version of the office water cooler, except with way more physical labor involved before you even got to the chatting part. Of course, this whole process also depended heavily on the weather and on the season. In winter, wells and streams could freeze over, meaning someone had to break through ice just to access the water underneath. In dry periods, water sources could run low, meaning longer walks to find a source that still had enough to offer. There was no consistency, no guarantee. Every day, the water situation was sort of its own little unpredictable task. And once the water was finally hauled back home, the job still wasn't quite done. A lot of water needed to be boiled before it was used, especially for drinking, which meant it had to sit over that fire we talked about last chapter, slowly heating up while everyone waited. So really, fire and water were sort of a package deal each morning. You needed one to make the other safe, and you needed both before you could even think about actually eating something. When you add it all up, hauling water, walking to and from a well or stream, dealing with contamination risks, boiling everything just to be safe. This was a huge chunk of physical effort spent purely on getting a basic drink of water. Something we do now without a second thought, just turning a tap, filling a glass, done in about 4 seconds. It really does put things into perspective. Next time you're annoyed your water bottle's empty and you have to walk to the kitchen, just remember, at least there's no bucket involved. At least there's no yoke digging into your shoulders. At least you're probably not one bad well away from getting sick for a week. Once the water was sorted, though, there was still the matter of actually getting dressed for the day. And in a world with limited clothing, no closets full of options, and definitely no heated bathroom to change in, that came with its own set of small miseries too. All right, fire's going, water's sorted, or at least on its way to being boiled. Now it's time to actually get dressed. And look, getting dressed sounds simple enough, right? We do it every single day without thinking too hard about it. But in medieval times, this small, boring task came with its own quiet list of discomforts, starting with the fact that you were probably still doing it in the dark, or close to it. Let's start with what people actually had to wear. And the answer is not much. Not in terms of variety, anyway. Most people, especially peasants, owned very few items of clothing. We're talking maybe 2 outfits total, if that. One for everyday wear, and if you were fortunate, a slightly nicer one saved for special occasions like church or a festival. That's it. No drawer full of options. No deciding what you're in the mood for today. You wore what you had, because that's all there was. And what you had was usually wool. Wool was the go-to fabric for most medieval clothing, mainly because it was practical, it was warmish, and it was something people could actually produce themselves through sheep farming and spinning. But wool, especially the rougher, cheaper varieties that regular people wore, was not exactly comfortable. It could be scratchy. It could be heavy, especially once it got even a little damp, which, given the general dampness of medieval life, happened a lot. Wearing slightly damp wool clothing was less cozy sweater and more wet dog blanket, if we're being honest. Underneath that wool, some people wore a simple linen layer, which helped a bit with the itchiness, sort of acting as a buffer between your skin and the scratchy wool on top. But linen wasn't universal. Depending on where you lived and how much money your family had, you might not have had that extra layer at all. Which means, for a lot of people, mornings involve putting rough wool directly against bare skin in the cold, right after crawling out of a flea-filled bed. Living the dream, truly. Now let's talk undergarments, because this part surprises people. The concept of underwear as we know it today, form-fitting, designed specifically for hygiene and comfort, wasn't really a big universal thing. Men often wore a simple garment called brays, which were kind of like loose linen shorts, tied at the waist. Women's undergarment situation was a bit murkier historically, and honestly, historians still debate exactly what was worn underneath in different regions and time periods. But broadly speaking, we're not talking about anything close to the range of options people have today. It was minimal, it was basic, and it definitely wasn't designed with comfort as the top priority. Layering was key too, especially in colder months. People would put on multiple garments, one over the other, partly for warmth, and partly because that was just the general silhouette of medieval fashion. A shirt or tunic, then maybe another layer over that. then an outer garment like a cloak or overcoat if you were heading outside into the cold. All of this had to be put on, piece by piece, in a home that, remember, still didn't have central heating and might still be filling up with smoke from that fire you just got going. And here's a small detail that's easy to overlook. A lot of medieval clothing didn't have the kind of easy fastenings we take for granted now. No zippers. Buttons existed, but weren't always common on everyday peasant clothing, especially earlier in the medieval period. A lot of garments were secured with laces or pins, or simply tied at certain points, which means getting dressed wasn't always a quick, thoughtless process. It could take a bit of fiddling, especially with cold, stiff fingers first thing in the morning. Shoes were their own adventure too. Footwear for most people was fairly simple, often made of leather, sometimes with wooden soles depending on the region and era. They weren't exactly cushioned. They weren't exactly waterproof either, which becomes a pretty big problem once you remember that a lot of the day involved walking on muddy roads, wet fields, or generally damp ground. So even your feet, right from the start of the day, weren't getting much protection from the elements. Privacy, or the lack of it, played into all this too. In a lot of homes, with everyone sharing one main living space, getting dressed wasn't some private, personal moment behind a closed door. It just sort of happened, in the same room everyone else was in, probably while someone else was tending the fire, and someone else was heading out to deal with water or animals. Modesty existed, of course, but the whole process was a lot more communal and a lot less private than most of us experience today. So by the time a medieval person was fully dressed, they'd already dealt with scratchy wool, cold fingers fumbling with ties and laces, minimal underclothes, and shoes that weren't going to do much against the mud waiting outside. And this was all just to get to a baseline, functional, okay, I guess I'm ready kind of state. No accessorizing, no outfit choices, just survival clothing, put on as efficiently as possible in a cold, dim room. It's honestly a little funny to think about how much decision-making goes into getting dressed today, standing in front of a closet, deciding what matches, what's clean, what we feel like wearing. Meanwhile, medieval people were just grabbing the one wool outfit they owned and hoping the ties held. Once dressed, though, there was still one more unglamorous stop before the day could really begin. And it's not a pleasant one, because next came dealing with, well, nature's call, and medieval bathrooms were an entire experience of their own. All right, deep breath. This chapter's a little gross, not gonna lie. But hey, it's an important part of the morning routine, so let's get into it. Because before breakfast, before chores, there was one more stop most people had to make. The privy, or in plainer terms, the toilet. And medieval toilets were an experience. Let's start with the basics. There was no indoor plumbing. None. No flush toilets. No pipes carrying waste neatly away to somewhere out of sight and out of mind. For most people, dealing with basic bodily functions meant one of two things. Either a chamber pot, kept somewhere inside the home, or an outdoor privy, which was basically a small structure built over a pit, doing the very simple job of, well, catching everything that fell into it. Let's talk chamber pots first, because these were incredibly common, especially for use at night or during bad weather, when nobody wanted to trek outside in the freezing cold just to relieve themselves. A chamber pot was exactly what it sounds like. A pot, kept in the bedroom or nearby, used as needed, then emptied out later. And where did it get emptied? Often, quite simply, out the window, into the street, or into a designated area outside. In towns and cities especially, this created a very particular smell that just sort of hung over everything. A smell that modern people, thankfully, never really have to experience firsthand. There's actually a fun little historical detail here. In some medieval towns, there were rules about calling out before dumping a chamber pot out a window, some version of a warning shout to give people below a chance to get out of the way. Not everyone followed this rule consistently, which meant walking through certain streets came with a very real risk of, let's say, an unpleasant surprise from above. Something to think about next time you're annoyed about stepping in a puddle. Now, outdoor privies. These were more common for regular daily use, especially in rural areas where there was actual space to build one. Basically, a small wooden or stone structure positioned over a pit dug into the ground, sometimes shared by multiple households or even a whole section of a village. Not exactly private in the way we think of bathroom privacy today, and definitely not heated, which means using one first thing on a cold winter morning was its own small act of bravery. These pits needed to be emptied out eventually too, and that job usually fell to specific workers, sometimes called gong farmers, whose entire profession was dealing with human waste removal. Not exactly a glamorous job title, but a genuinely necessary one, and probably one of the least appreciated professions in medieval society, considering how important sanitation actually was to keeping a community from descending into complete chaos and disease. And speaking of disease, sanitation, or the general lack of proper sanitation, was a massive factor in medieval health problems. Without a real understanding of germs or how disease actually spread, waste disposal methods were often way too close to water sources or too close to living spaces, creating conditions that were, frankly, a breeding ground for illness. Contaminated water, as we talked about back in the water chapter, was a huge issue, and a lot of that contamination traced right back to poor waste management. It's honestly a pretty grim cycle when you think about it, one problem feeding right into another. Toilet paper, by the way, wasn't really a thing yet either. People made do with whatever was available. Leaves, moss, old rags, sometimes even the leftover fibers from rope making called tow. It really depended on what region you were in and what resources you had access to. Definitely not the soft, plush, multiply situation we're used to today. More of a grab what's nearby and hope for the best kind of system. For wealthier households and castles, things were slightly more developed. Some castles had a feature called a garderobe, which was basically a small toilet room built into the thick castle walls, often positioned so waste would drop straight down the outside of the building, sometimes directly into the moat. Which, honestly, explains a lot about why moats had such a particular reputation. Not exactly the romantic, knights and princesses image people tend to imagine. Hand washing after all this. Also not really a standardized practice the way it is today. Basic hygiene concepts existed, sure, but the deep understanding of hand hygiene and its connection to preventing illness just wasn't really established yet. People washed their hands sometimes, for sure, but it wasn't the automatic, ingrained habit most of us have now. So by the time this whole part of the morning was done, dealing with a chamber pot, or trekking out to a shared, freezing cold outdoor privy, using questionable toilet paper alternatives, and not necessarily washing up with anything close to modern standards, you can start to understand why medieval mornings come with such a strong, distinct smell attached to them in a lot of historical accounts. It wasn't pleasant, it wasn't private, and it definitely wasn't quick, especially in bad weather. It really does make you appreciate indoor plumbing on a whole new level, doesn't it? Next time you're annoyed about a slow flush or a chilly bathroom floor, just remember, at least there's no walk outside involved. At least there's no gong farmer situation happening. At least, generally speaking, nothing's getting dumped out a window onto your head. And once that whole ordeal was finished, there was still one more hygiene-related task left before the day could truly begin. Washing up, which, as you might expect by now, came with its own set of medieval quirks and questionable medical theories. All right, so the privy business is behind us, thankfully. Now let's talk about washing up. And look, if you're picturing a nice warm shower, steam filling up the bathroom, maybe some relaxing music playing in the background, you can go ahead and let that image go completely. Because medieval washing was a very different, very brief, and honestly kind of chilly experience. First thing to understand is, there was no running water in most homes. No shower. No bathtub with a tap you could just turn on. Any washing that happened involved water that had already been hauled in, probably that same water we talked about back in Chapter 5, carried from a well or stream, sitting in a basin or bucket somewhere in the house. And unless someone had specifically heated some of it over the fire, that water was cold. Properly cold. Splash your face with that first thing in the morning kind of cold. So for most people, the daily washing routine was pretty minimal. A quick splash of water on the face and hands, maybe. That was often it. Full body washing, the kind of thing we consider totally normal today, just wasn't a daily occurrence for the average person. It happened, sure, but way less frequently than you'd expect, sometimes just once a week, sometimes even less, depending on the season, your access to water, and honestly, just general cultural habits at the time. Now here's where it gets interesting, because there was actually a bit of medical thinking behind this too, not just laziness or lack of resources. Medieval medicine was heavily influenced by something called humoral theory. This idea that the body was made up of four balances: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that health depended on keeping these in balance. Under this theory, some medical thinkers actually believed that hot water could open up the pores of the skin, and that this made a person more vulnerable to disease entering the body. So in a strange way, some people genuinely thought that bathing too much, especially in hot water, could actually make you sick rather than keep you clean and healthy. This belief became even stronger during times of plague and widespread illness, which medieval Europe unfortunately experienced quite a lot of. When disease was spreading and nobody understood germs or bacteria, people looked for any explanation that made sense to them. And maybe bathing opens you up to sickness became one of those explanations that stuck around for a surprisingly long time. So bathing wasn't just inconvenient. It was sometimes actively viewed as risky. That said, it's worth mentioning that bathing habits did vary a lot depending on time period, region, and social class. Earlier in the medieval period, and in certain areas, actual bathhouses were fairly popular, sort of communal spaces where people could soak, socialize, and get properly clean. But over time, especially as fears around disease grew, and as these communal bathhouses started developing a bit of a reputation for less than hygienic behavior beyond just bathing, their popularity declined in a lot of places. So it wasn't that medieval people never valued cleanliness, more that their relationship with bathing shifted a lot throughout the era and wasn't nearly as consistent or frequent as our modern daily shower routine. Soap, when it was used, wasn't the gentle, nicely scented bar you might picture either. Medieval soap was often a pretty harsh mixture, sometimes made from animal fat and ash, and it wasn't exactly kind to your skin. Wealthier households might have access to slightly nicer versions, sometimes with added scents, but for most regular folks, soap, if used at all, was a basic, functional, slightly rough product, not something you'd want to use on your face every single day. Teeth cleaning, while we're on this topic, was similarly basic. There were no toothbrushes as we know them. Some people used a rough cloth to rub their teeth clean, sometimes with a bit of salt or other abrasive substance. Dental health, as a result, was often pretty rough across the medieval population, something we'll actually circle back to a little later when we talk about the physical toll medieval life took on the body. Hair washing was another infrequent event. Combing hair regularly was more common, since that helped with, let's just say, unwanted little visitors like lice, which we already know were a pretty constant companion in medieval daily life. But actual hair washing with anything resembling shampoo just wasn't really part of the daily or even weekly routine for most people. So when you put it all together, a splash of cold water, maybe a quick pass with some harsh soap if available, minimal actual bathing, and a general belief among some that too much washing might actually be bad for your health, you start to get a picture of just how different medieval hygiene was from what we consider normal today. It wasn't that people didn't care about cleanliness at all. It's more that their entire understanding of health, combined with the sheer physical effort required just to access water, shaped a completely different relationship with washing than we have now. It's honestly kind of wild to think that hopping in a warm shower, something most of us do without a second thought, would have seemed almost suspicious to some medieval folks. Extra clean? Careful. That might just be an open invitation for illness to sneak right in. Once this brief, chilly, slightly questionable hygiene routine was done, though, it was finally time to think about food. And breakfast, if it existed at all in any real sense, was about to bring its own set of surprises. All right, so by this point in the morning, our medieval friend has survived the cold, gotten dressed in scratchy wool, dealt with the privy situation, splashed a bit of cold water on their face, and somehow still hasn't eaten a single thing. And here's a fun little fact. For a lot of medieval people, that wasn't necessarily about to change anytime soon. Because breakfast, as a proper, expected meal, wasn't always really a thing. This might sound strange to us today, since breakfast gets called the most important meal of the day, and skipping it feels like a big deal. But in medieval times, especially in certain periods and among certain social classes, breakfast had a bit of a complicated reputation. In fact, there was actually a religious and moral element to it. Some church teachings at the time associated eating early in the morning, before any work had been done, with gluttony or with a lack of self-discipline. The thinking went something like, Why are you eating before you've even earned it through labor or prayer? Which, honestly, is a pretty intense way to start judging someone's day before they've even had a bite of anything. So for a good chunk of medieval history, especially for adults, particularly among the more religiously observant or the upper classes trying to seem virtuous, skipping breakfast or keeping it extremely minimal was actually seen as the more respectable option. Kids, laborers, and the elderly were often given a bit more leeway here, since the physical demands on their bodies were recognized as needing some fuel to get through the day. But even then, we're not talking about anything close to a big cooked breakfast spread. When breakfast did happen, it was usually incredibly simple. We're talking bread, often a day or two old, maybe dipped in some ale to soften it up a bit, since fresh bread wasn't always baked daily in every household. And when we say bread, it's worth remembering, this wasn't the soft, fluffy, perfectly sliced bread we're used to today. Peasant bread was often dense, dark, made from a mix of grains depending on what was available and affordable, sometimes even including things like barley or rye mixed in with wheat, or in tougher times, whatever grain could be sourced at all. Pottage was another common option, and honestly, pottage shows up so often in medieval meals that it's basically the unofficial mascot of medieval food. Pottage was essentially a thick soup or stew, usually made from grains, vegetables, whatever was on hand, sometimes with a bit of meat if the household could afford it, simmered slowly over that fire we talked about earlier. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't seasoned with a huge range of spices, since spices were expensive and mostly reserved for wealthier tables. But it was filling, and it could be stretched to feed a whole family, which mattered a lot more than flavor variety when resources were tight. And then there was ale, again. We already talked about how ale was often safer to drink than plain water, and this carried right into breakfast time too. A cup of weak ale alongside some bread was a pretty standard start to the day for a lot of working people. Not because everyone loved the taste of morning alcohol, but because it was a reliable, relatively safe source of hydration and a few extra calories to get through physical labor. For wealthier households, breakfast, when it happened, could look a little different, maybe including things like eggs or a bit of meat or better quality bread. But even among nobility, breakfast wasn't typically the big, elaborate meal we think of today. The main event of the day, food-wise, was usually reserved for later, a more substantial midday meal after a chunk of work had already been done. Which makes sense in a weird way. Earn your big meal first, then eat it. Portion sizes and food access also varied a lot depending on the season and how the previous harvest had gone. Late winter and early spring, right before new crops came in, could be particularly lean times, when stored food from the previous harvest was running low. So breakfast, if it existed at all during these stretches, might be even more minimal than usual. A small piece of bread, maybe nothing at all for some, especially in poorer households hit by a bad harvest year. It's honestly kind of wild to think about starting a full day of hard physical labor, walking to fields, tending animals, hauling water, all of that, on essentially a small piece of stale bread and maybe a cup of weak ale. No protein-packed smoothie. No hearty plate of eggs and toast. Just enough to sort of take the edge off, and then straight into a demanding day of work. There's something almost admirable about it too, honestly. The idea that people just pushed through, day after day, on such minimal fuel, without the luxury of a big breakfast to properly set them up. It really puts into perspective just how physically tough medieval daily life actually was, right from the very start. So by the time breakfast, or the absence of it, was done, our medieval friends still hadn't really had much of anything substantial. Cold, slightly damp clothes, minimal hygiene, and now a stomach that's only just barely been addressed. And yet, the day's real physical work hadn't even started yet, because next up was the walk to the fields, and medieval roads were an entire challenge all on their own. All right, fire's going, water's hauled, clothes are on, breakfast, such as it was, has been eaten or not eaten, depending on the day. Now it's time for the actual work to begin. And for a huge number of medieval people, that meant a walk, often a pretty long one, out to whatever fields needed tending that day. See, medieval villages weren't always set up the way we might imagine, with everyone's farmland conveniently located right behind their house. In a lot of areas, especially those using what's called the open field system, farmland was divided into large shared fields, split into strips, with different families working different strips scattered across the area. Which means your particular patch of land to work that day might not be anywhere near your actual home. Could be a 15, 20, sometimes even 30-minute walk, one way, just to get to where the actual work was happening. And this walk wasn't happening on a nice paved sidewalk. Medieval roads and paths were, generously speaking, rough. Dirt paths, mostly. Sometimes worn down into deep ruts from years of cartwheels and foot traffic. In dry weather, these paths could be hard, uneven, and honestly kind of ankle-twisting territory if you weren't paying attention. But in wet weather, and let's be honest, medieval weather involved a whole lot of rain. These same paths turned into something closer to a mud swamp. And we're not talking a little bit of mud on your boots kind of situation. We're talking thick, sticky, sometimes ankle-deep mud that pulled at your feet with every single step. Imagine trying to walk any real distance through that, first thing in the morning, in shoes that, remember, weren't exactly waterproof, weren't exactly cushioned, and definitely weren't designed with any kind of grip technology in mind. Just simple leather, doing its best, slowly getting soaked through with cold, muddy water. There's a reason medieval people are often depicted as looking a bit weathered, a bit worn down. A huge part of that comes from just how much walking, in rough conditions, through unpredictable weather, was baked into daily life. This wasn't a nice morning stroll for exercise. This was a necessary, often uncomfortable trek, done regardless of whether it was raining, freezing, or blazing hot, because the work still needed to get done either way. And speaking of weather, there really wasn't much protection available. We touched on this a bit before, but it's worth repeating here specifically. No proper waterproof jackets. No sturdy waterproof boots. Maybe a simple cloak made of wool, which, as we know, gets heavy and kind of gross when wet. So a rainy morning walk to the fields often meant arriving already damp, already a bit miserable, before a single hour of actual work had even started. Livestock sometimes made this journey too, if animals needed to be moved to grazing areas, which added its own layer of complication. Trying to herd animals along muddy paths, keeping them together, keeping them out of other people's crops or strips of land, all while also just trying to get yourself safely to where you needed to be. Not exactly a peaceful morning walk. Distance and terrain also varied a lot depending on where exactly someone lived. Villages nestled in flatter areas might have had a slightly easier go of it, comparatively speaking. But plenty of medieval communities were located in hillier, more uneven terrain, which meant the walk to the fields involved actual elevation change too, on top of everything else. Steep paths, slippery slopes when wet, all adding extra physical strain to what was already a demanding start to the day. And here's something worth remembering. This walk wasn't a one-time thing either. Depending on the task, people might be making this trip multiple times throughout the day. Heading out in the morning, maybe coming back for something at midday, heading back out again. Every single trip meant navigating those same rough paths, that same unpredictable mud, that same total lack of proper footwear protection. Tools had to be carried too, on this walk. Basic farming equipment, things like hoes or scythes or baskets for carrying whatever was being harvested or gathered. So this wasn't just a walk with empty hands either. There was usually something heavy, something awkward, being hauled along the entire way, adding even more physical effort to an already tiring trip. By the time a medieval worker actually reached the fields, ready to start their real workday, they'd already walked a significant distance, likely through mud, possibly in the rain, wearing damp clothes, carrying tools, on a stomach that hadn't had much more than some bread and weak ale. And this was all considered completely normal. Just the standard, expected start to an ordinary day. It really does highlight just how much unseen effort went into daily medieval life. Effort that happened before the actual work even technically began. We tend to think of farming as the labor, the plowing, the harvesting, the physical tasks in the fields themselves. But honestly, just getting to that starting point was its own significant task, one that would leave most of us modern folks pretty exhausted before even picking up a single tool. And once they finally arrived, ready to begin, there was one more thing working against them that we haven't even touched on yet. Because a huge number of medieval people were already dealing with chronic physical pain and health issues, long before this workday had even started. All right, our medieval friend has finally made it to the fields. Cold morning, survived. Bugs in the bed, survived. Muddy walk, survived. Ready to start working now, right? Well, sort of. Because here's something that often gets overlooked. A huge number of medieval people were starting their workday already dealing with some kind of chronic pain or physical discomfort. Not from that morning specifically. From basically just existing in a medieval body for however many years they'd been alive. Let's start with something that sounds small, but actually had a massive impact. Teeth. Dental health in medieval times was, to put it gently, rough. We touched on this a little before with the rough cloth and salt situation for cleaning teeth, but the bigger issue was diet and general dental care over a lifetime. Diets often included a lot of coarse, gritty bread, sometimes with bits of stone or grit accidentally mixed in from the milling process. Over years of eating this, teeth would wear down significantly. Add in the lack of modern dental care, no regular checkups, no fillings, no real treatment beyond extraction if things got bad enough, and you end up with a population dealing with a whole lot of tooth pain, tooth loss, and related infections, often starting at a surprisingly young age. And dental problems weren't just annoying. Untreated tooth infections can actually become serious, even life-threatening, if they spread. So this wasn't just a "my tooth hurts a bit" situation for a lot of people. It could genuinely be a significant, ongoing health issue, quietly affecting daily life, including, of course, that whole minimal breakfast situation we talked about last chapter. Chewing tough, dense bread with a mouth full of dental problems? Not exactly pleasant. Now let's talk about joints and general body wear. Remember, this was a population doing intense, repetitive physical labor, day after day, year after year, often starting in childhood and continuing well into old age, assuming someone even reached what we'd consider old age. Bending, lifting, walking long distances, carrying heavy loads. All of this takes a serious toll on joints over time. Arthritis, back problems, and general joint pain were incredibly common, and without modern pain management options, people mostly just had to push through it. Malnutrition also played a significant role here, and it's worth spending a moment on this, because it connects to a lot of what we've already covered. Diets, especially for poorer households, could be pretty limited in variety, particularly during leaner seasons or after a bad harvest. This meant a lot of people, especially children, grew up without adequate nutrition, which affects bone development, immune function, and overall physical resilience later in life. Someone who experienced malnutrition as a child might carry the physical effects of that their entire life, things like weaker bones, or a smaller overall stature, or a body that's just generally more prone to illness and injury. Childhood itself, honestly, comes with its own quiet layer of hardship here. Child mortality rates were high, and kids who did survive to adulthood had often already experienced their fair share of illness, injury, or nutritional stress along the way. So by the time someone reached working age, their body might already be carrying the effects of a genuinely difficult start in life, long before we even get to the physical demands of daily medieval labor. Injuries, too, were just a normal part of life, and they didn't always heal properly. A broken bone, without proper medical setting or care, might heal slightly crooked or with lasting stiffness or pain. Cuts and wounds, without a real understanding of infection prevention, could turn into serious problems fairly easily. Something as simple as a small cut from farm work could, in the wrong circumstances, become a genuinely dangerous infection, with no antibiotics available to help fight it off. And then there's just general fatigue. We've walked through, quite literally, everything that happened before actual field work even started. The cold wake up, the physical effort of hauling water, the walk through mud, all fueled by minimal food. So even before picking up a tool and starting the actual labor of the day, a lot of people were already running on a pretty significant physical deficit. Tired, a little hungry, joints already aching, maybe a tooth throbbing quietly in the background, and the actual demanding work of the day hadn't even begun yet. It's honestly a pretty sobering thing to sit with. We tend to picture medieval workers as tough, hardy, capable of enduring intense physical labor without much complaint. And in a lot of ways, that's true, they had to be. But that toughness often came from a place of genuine, ongoing physical hardship, not from some kind of superior strength or resilience that people today somehow lack. It was survival, plain and simple, and it came at a real cost to the body over time. There wasn't really an alternative either. No calling in sick with achy joints. No skipping a day of work because a tooth was bothering you. The fields needed tending, the animals needed care, and the work simply had to get done, regardless of how the body attached to the person doing that work happened to be feeling that particular morning. So as our medieval friend finally picks up their tools and gets started with the actual work of the day, it's worth remembering, this already exhausted, already aching body was the baseline, not the exception, just normal. And speaking of the work itself, before any field work even really got underway, there was usually one more task waiting first. The animals. Because livestock, it turns out, came before almost everything else. All right, so technically, we've been building up to the fields this whole time. But here's a little curveball. For a lot of medieval households, before any actual fieldwork could start, there was another task waiting, one that honestly took priority over almost everything else. Animals. Because if you had livestock, and a lot of families did, even if it was just one or two animals, those animals needed attention first, no exceptions. Think about it from a practical standpoint. Animals can't wait. A cow that needs milking doesn't really care that you're tired, or that your joints hurt, or that you'd love 5 more minutes before starting your day. Chickens need feeding. Pigs need feeding. Any animal being kept for food, for milk, for wool, or for labor, like oxen or horses used for plowing, needed some level of care first thing in the morning, and honestly, throughout the day too. Let's start with milking, since this is a pretty classic image of rural morning life, and for good reason. If a household had a cow, or maybe some goats or sheep, morning milking was an early, essential task. And this wasn't a quick, casual thing either. Milking by hand takes real time, real skill, and honestly, a fair bit of patience, especially if you're doing it in a cold barn, with cold hands, first thing in the morning. Miss a proper milking session, and you're not just inconveniencing yourself, you're risking the health and comfort of the animal too. Chickens needed their own attention as well. Feeding them, checking for eggs, making sure they were safe from whatever predators might be lurking around. Foxes being a particularly persistent problem in a lot of medieval farming communities. Losing chickens to a predator wasn't just sad. It was a genuine loss of food and income for a family that likely didn't have much margin for that kind of setback. And then there were the bigger animals, if a family was fortunate enough to have them. Oxen or horses used for plowing needed feeding, watering, and general care before they could even be hitched up and used for the day's field work. Which means, before the actual plowing or heavy field labor could even begin, there was this whole separate block of animal care that had to happen first. It's kind of like, imagine needing to fully service your car every single morning before you're even allowed to drive it to work. Except the car also needs feeding and occasionally gets sick and can also kick you if you're not careful. Pigs, too, needed tending, generally a bit less intensive than milking or plow animal care, but still requiring feeding and some basic oversight, especially since pigs had a bit of a reputation for being escape artists, wandering off if given half a chance. Now here's an interesting detail we touched on briefly before. Remember how some animals actually lived quite close to people, sometimes even sharing part of the same living space? This wasn't just for warmth, though that was definitely a factor. It also made this whole morning care routine a little more manageable, since you didn't necessarily have to travel far to reach your animals. Though, of course, having animals essentially as roommates came with its own set of, let's say, aromatic downsides that we probably don't need to spend too much time dwelling on. For families relying on livestock as a genuine part of their livelihood, this morning animal care wasn't optional, and it wasn't something that could be rushed or skipped, even on days when the person doing it was exhausted, sore, or just generally not feeling great. The animals represented real, tangible value: food, milk, wool, labor, and neglecting them, even briefly, could have serious consequences for the whole family's well-being. There's also a bit of an emotional layer here worth mentioning. For a lot of medieval families, animals weren't just resources, they were also, in some way, part of daily life and routine, something people developed a working relationship with over time. Not necessarily in some deeply sentimental way we might think of pets today, but there was still a level of care and attention that went beyond pure transaction. A healthy, well cared for animal meant a healthier, more stable household. So there was real incentive to do this job well, consistently, morning after morning. Weather, once again, played its unhelpful role here too. Bad weather didn't mean animals got a pass on care. If anything, harsh conditions often meant animals needed extra attention, extra shelter checks, extra care to make sure they were staying healthy through difficult stretches of cold or rain. So this task, just like so many others we've covered, had zero flexibility built into it. Rain or shine, exhausted or not, the animals came first. By the time all this animal care was actually finished, milking done, feeding done, plow animals prepared and ready, our medieval worker still hadn't technically started their main field work for the day. And yet, they'd already put in a genuinely significant amount of effort, on top of everything else we've covered so far. The fire, the water, the walk, and now the animals. It really paints a picture of just how much invisible labor filled up a medieval morning before the real work even properly began. And once the animals were settled and the actual field work could finally start, there was still one more layer shaping the whole day. Because for a lot of people, religious duty and obligation were woven right into the rhythm of daily life too, whether there was time for it or not. All right, fire, water, clothes, privy, breakfast, the walk, and now the animals, all handled. At this point, our medieval friend has genuinely earned a little break, right? Well, not quite yet, because there was still one more thing woven into the rhythm of the morning, something that touched pretty much every aspect of daily life back then: religion, and specifically, the obligations that came along with it. We already talked a little bit about church bells back in Chapter 3, how they served as this rough, communal way of marking time throughout the day. But bells weren't just about telling time. They were also calling people to prayer, to Mass, to various religious observances that were considered, in a lot of communities, just as essential as any of the physical tasks we've already covered. Faith wasn't really treated as a separate, optional part of life back then. It was deeply woven into the everyday rhythm, right alongside fire tending and water hauling and animal care. For a lot of medieval people, especially in more religiously observant communities, the day genuinely did include some form of morning prayer or church attendance, even amid all the physical demands we've already walked through. Depending on where someone lived, and how devout their particular community was. This might mean an actual trip to the local church for morning mass, or it might mean simpler prayers said at home, perhaps while working or during those brief pauses between tasks. Village churches were often central, both physically and socially, to community life. The church building itself was frequently one of the largest, most prominent structures in a village, and attending Mass wasn't just a private, personal spiritual practice. It was also a communal event, a chance to see neighbors, share information, and participate in the shared rhythm of village life. So in some ways, church attendance served a dual purpose: spiritual obligation on one hand, social connection on the other. Now, here's where things get a little more nuanced and honestly a bit more human. Not everyone had equal ability to prioritize these religious observances, especially during busy agricultural periods like planting or harvest season. If the fields desperately needed attention, if animals needed urgent care, if weather conditions created a narrow window for essential work, the reality was that some of these religious duties might get shortened, adjusted, or in some cases, skipped entirely, out of sheer practical necessity. The church understood this too, to some degree, with certain allowances made for agricultural workers during particularly demanding seasons. But there was still an underlying sense of obligation that shaped how people thought about their time, even when practical demands took priority. This wasn't really a world where faith was treated as something separate from daily labor. Many medieval people saw their work itself, tending the land, caring for animals, providing for their family, as something connected to their religious duty, a reflection of doing right by their faith through honest, diligent effort. So even when someone couldn't make it to a formal church service, there was often still this underlying sense that the work itself carried a kind of moral weight. For those living in or near monasteries, remember those canonical hours we mentioned back in Chapter 3? Those incredibly disrupted sleep schedules, with prayer happening multiple times throughout the day and night? For monks and nuns, this rigid religious schedule wasn't just an obligation woven into an already busy day. It essentially was the day, the primary structure around which everything else revolved. Regular villagers didn't typically follow anywhere near this intense a schedule, but the bells ringing from nearby monasteries or churches still served as a constant, audible reminder of this deeper religious rhythm underlying daily life. There's also the matter of religious holidays and feast days, which, interestingly, actually provided some of the only real breaks from the relentless grind of daily labor that we've been describing throughout this whole video. Certain days throughout the year were designated for rest, for community celebration, tied to religious calendars. These weren't necessarily frequent, and they certainly didn't erase the general hardship of daily medieval life. But they did offer occasional, meaningful pauses, moments where the community came together for something other than pure survival and labor. It's worth noting, too, that religious guilt, or a sense of moral obligation, could add its own quiet layer of pressure to daily life. Remember that breakfast chapter, where we talked about how eating early was sometimes viewed as a sign of gluttony or lack of discipline? That same kind of thinking extended into other areas, too. This idea that laziness, or skipping religious duty without good reason, reflected poorly on a person's character and moral standing within the community. So there was a real social and spiritual pressure to keep up with these obligations, even amid an already exhausting daily routine. By the time all these layers were considered, physical labor, religious duty, social expectation, it becomes pretty clear that medieval mornings weren't just physically demanding. They came with a whole invisible structure of obligation and meaning too, shaping how people thought about their time, their work, and their place within the community. And speaking of place within the community, not everyone's morning looked the same. Because how all of this played out, the labor, the obligations, the general hardship we've been describing, actually varied quite a bit depending on where someone sat in the medieval social hierarchy. Which brings us to a pretty important question. What did a noble's morning actually look like, compared to everyone else's? Alright, so we've spent this whole video walking through what a pretty typical, working-class medieval morning looked like. Cold, damp, physically demanding, filled with obligation from start to finish. But here's the thing. Not everyone experienced mornings this way. Medieval society was incredibly stratified, and where you sat in that social structure had a massive impact on what your morning actually involved. Let's start at the top, with nobility. A noble's morning looked pretty different from everything we've covered so far, though maybe not quite as dramatically different as you might assume, at least not in every single detail. Nobles still woke up in a world without central heating. Remember, so cold mornings weren't exclusively a peasant problem. Even a well-built castle or manor house could be drafty, especially in the early hours before fires had really gotten going properly throughout the building. But here's where things start to diverge. A noble waking up in the morning likely wasn't the one starting that fire themselves. That job belonged to servants, who were often up well before their employers, making sure that by the time a noble actually rose, there was already some warmth building in the room, maybe even a fire already crackling away, ready and waiting. Quite a different experience compared to fumbling with flint and steel with freezing fingers in the dark. Clothing, too, told a very different story. While our peasant friend was dealing with scratchy wool and minimal options, nobility had access to a much wider range of fabrics, including softer wools, linens, and for the truly wealthy, silks brought in through trade. And getting dressed often wasn't even something a noble did entirely on their own. Servants frequently assisted with dressing, particularly for more elaborate outfits that involved multiple layers, complicated fastenings, or garments that were simply difficult to manage alone. Washing, too, could look somewhat different, though remember, that whole hesitancy around bathing due to humoral theory affected people across social classes, not just peasants. Still, wealthier households had more consistent access to heated water, since they had servants dedicated to hauling and warming it, rather than needing to do that labor themselves, first thing in a freezing morning. Breakfast is actually a really interesting point of comparison here too. Remember how we talked about breakfast sometimes being viewed as a bit gluttonous or lacking discipline? This attitude was actually often even stronger among certain religious and noble circles trying to project an image of restraint and piety. So somewhat surprisingly, some wealthy households still kept breakfast pretty minimal, at least in the earlier parts of the medieval period, not because of lack of access to food, but because of that same underlying cultural attitude we discussed before. That said, when nobility did eat a more substantial early meal, The quality and variety were obviously on a completely different level. Fresh bread instead of stale. Meat, eggs, maybe even imported items like specific spices, depending on the wealth and connections of the household. So while the timing and cultural attitude toward breakfast might have had some overlap with peasant experience, the actual substance of what was on offer was worlds apart. Now let's flip this around for a moment, because it's worth remembering that a noble's comfortable morning didn't happen by magic. It happened because of servants, and servants had their own version of this whole difficult morning we've spent this entire video describing. Servants working within a noble household were often up earlier than anyone else, tending fires, hauling water, preparing food, getting everything ready before their employers even opened their eyes. In a lot of ways, servants experienced the physical hardship of a peasant-style morning, the cold, early starts, and demanding physical labor, while also being responsible for making someone else's morning as comfortable and effortless as possible. This creates a pretty interesting dynamic when you think about it. The comfort experienced by nobility each morning was essentially built directly on top of the hardship experienced by the people serving them. It's not like the difficulty of a medieval morning disappeared for the wealthy. It just got shifted onto someone else's shoulders, someone whose job it was to absorb that hardship quietly, invisibly, so their employer's day could start just a little bit easier. There's also the matter of general free time and flexibility, which nobility obviously had considerably more of. While a peasant's entire morning was dictated by strict necessity, fire, water, animals, fieldwork, a noble had considerably more choice in how their morning unfolded. They might spend time on leisure activities, correspondence, estate management, or religious devotion, but crucially, they had the flexibility to choose, rather than being driven purely by immediate survival needs. It's worth acknowledging, too, that this comparison isn't meant to diminish the genuine responsibilities that came with noble status. Managing an estate, dealing with political obligations, and maintaining social standing came with their own pressures and demands. But in terms of the sheer, grinding, physical discomfort we've spent this whole video walking through, that particular burden fell overwhelmingly on the lower classes, the peasants doing the field work, and the servants supporting noble households from before dawn until well after dark. So when we picture medieval mornings, it's worth remembering there wasn't just one single medieval morning experience. There were many, layered across a rigid social structure, with comfort and hardship distributed pretty unevenly, depending purely on the circumstances someone happened to be born into. And regardless of where someone sat in this social hierarchy, though, there was one thing absolutely nobody could fully escape or control: the weather. Because no amount of wealth or status could completely shield anyone from what the sky decided to do on any given morning. By now, you have made it through a medieval morning. At least, most of it. You have climbed out of a scratchy bed, fought with the fire, carried water, eaten a small breakfast if you were lucky, and started work before the sun was fully awake. Now comes one more problem: the weather. Today, we can look outside a window, check an app, and decide if we need a jacket. If it is raining too hard, many people simply stay indoors. If it is freezing, we turn on the heater. If it is very hot, we search for air conditioning and complain that it is still not cold enough. A medieval peasant would probably laugh at those complaints. Not because life was funny, because there was no other choice. Rain did not cancel the day's work. Snow did not give anyone a holiday. Heat did not shorten the hours. The weather was simply another boss, and it was one that never listened to excuses. Imagine waking up to heavy rain, not a gentle drizzle, a cold rain that soaks through thick wool within minutes. Your clothes become heavy. Your shoes, if you even have proper shoes, fill with muddy water. Every step makes a wet, squishing sound that follows you all day. There are no waterproof jackets, no rubber boots, no umbrellas that fold neatly into a backpack. If you are lucky, you have a rough wool cloak. It keeps some rain away for a little while. Then it becomes just another wet blanket hanging from your shoulders. And it is heavy, very heavy. By the time you reach the fields, you are already tired. The ground is worse. Medieval roads were often little more than dirt paths. When rain arrived, those paths became thick rivers of mud. Wagons became stuck. People slipped. Animals struggled. Sometimes the mud reached above your ankles. If you have ever stepped into a puddle and had one wet sock ruin your whole mood, imagine living where every road felt like that for weeks. Your feet stay wet all day. Then you sleep in damp shoes because they never fully dry. Not exactly luxury. Winter brought different problems. Many homes had tiny windows or no glass at all. Cold air slipped through cracks in the walls. Smoke escaped wherever it could, but plenty stayed inside. Even with a fire burning, parts of the house remained chilly. Outside, the wind seemed to find every gap in your clothing. Wool helped. Layers helped. Moving around helped. Standing still did not. Cold fingers made simple jobs harder. Cold toes made walking painful. Even holding a wooden tool for hours became uncomfortable. People did not have heated gloves, or hand warmers, or thick insulated coats. Mostly, they just kept working, because stopping did not make the cold disappear. Then came summer. You might think summer would finally bring relief. Not really. Working in the fields under a hot sun was exhausting. There was little shade. Water had to be carried by hand. Sweat soaked clothing that was already rough against the skin. Flies appeared in huge numbers. So did biting insects. Every animal seemed to attract another cloud of buzzing visitors. Cows had flies. Horses had flies. People had flies. Even food attracted flies. Sometimes it probably felt as though every tiny creature in the countryside had agreed to ruin your morning. Spring and autumn had their own surprises. One day could be warm enough to work comfortably. The next morning could bring freezing winds or unexpected frost. Farmers depended on seasons that refused to follow perfect schedules. A late frost could damage crops. Too much rain could drown them. Too little rain could dry them out. Modern weather forecasts may not always be perfect, but medieval farmers had something much less reliable. They looked at the sky. They watched birds. They noticed the wind. Sometimes they guessed correctly. Sometimes nature had other plans. Storms could be terrifying. Thunder echoed across open fields. Lightning struck trees, barns, and sometimes people. Without modern science, many believed powerful storms carried messages from God or signs of judgment. It was difficult not to think that way when the sky suddenly turned black in the middle of the day. Then there was fog. A thick morning fog could cover roads, rivers, and fields. Travel slowed down. People got lost. Shapes appeared and disappeared in the mist. It is easy to imagine why so many old stories included strange creatures hiding in forests. when visibility is only a few feet. Even an ordinary tree can look suspicious. The weather also changed how homes smelled. Rain brought damp straw, wet clothes, wet animals, wet wood that refused to burn properly. Summer brought stronger smells from waste, animals, and standing water. Winter trapped smoke inside houses for longer. There was really no perfect season. Each one simply offered a different collection of discomforts. Perhaps the hardest part was the lack of control. Today, we can close a window, turn on a fan, drive instead of walk, delay a meeting, order groceries without leaving home. A medieval peasant could do none of those things. If the weather was miserable, life was miserable. Simple as that. Nature decided the schedule. Nature decided the conditions. And nature never accepted complaints. Although, if it did, it probably would have heard quite a few. As our slow walk through this medieval morning comes to an end, it is worth stopping for one last thought. Many people today dream about the past. They picture quiet villages, stone cottages with little gardens, fresh bread cooling on wooden tables, birds singing while smoke curls gently from chimneys. Everything feels peaceful, simple, almost magical. And to be fair, those moments probably did exist. Sometimes. But they were only part of the story. The average medieval morning was not built for comfort. It was built for survival. Every hour carried another task waiting to be done. The fire needed attention. The animals needed feeding. The water had to be carried. The fields were waiting. The weather had already decided whether today would be merely difficult or completely miserable. Very few people had the luxury of asking themselves an important modern question. What do I feel like doing today? The answer did not matter. The work still had to happen. It is easy to look at old paintings and imagine calm, happy lives. Paintings rarely include the smell, or the fleas, or the aching backs, or the muddy shoes. Artists had a funny habit of leaving out the unpleasant parts, probably because no one wanted a large painting called Farmer with wet socks and 3 chickens. That would not brighten many castle walls. Life expectancy was shorter. Medicine was limited. A small cut could become dangerous. A bad harvest could mean hunger. One harsh winter could change an entire village forever. Yet people still laughed. They still celebrated weddings. They still told stories around the fire. Children still played games. Neighbors still helped one another during difficult times. People have always found ways to smile, even when life is hard. That may be one thing that has never changed. The medieval world was not endless suffering every single minute. But neither was it the peaceful fairy tale we often imagine. It was ordinary, and ordinary life was difficult. That is perhaps the biggest surprise. You did not need a battle, a plague, or a dragon to have a terrible day. You simply needed Monday. Of course, medieval people did not call it Monday the way we do. But you understand the feeling. Most mornings began before sunrise. Most ended with sore muscles. Then it all happened again. Day after day, season after season, year after year. When we visit castles today, they often seem beautiful. The stone walls look impressive. The towers stand proudly against the sky. Visitors wander through great halls, taking photographs and imagining grand feasts. What we do not always picture are the servants carrying endless buckets, the smoky kitchens, the cold bedrooms, the endless cleaning. Even wealthy households depended on hard work from many unseen people. The comforts we enjoy today arrived slowly over hundreds of years. clean water from a tap, warm showers, electric lights, soft mattresses, medicine, heating, glass windows that actually keep the wind outside. These things feel ordinary because we use them every day. For most of human history, they would have seemed almost magical. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden inside an average medieval morning. History is not only about kings, queens, battles, or famous names. It is also about ordinary people waking up before dawn, rubbing tired eyes, and hoping today might be just a little easier than yesterday. Most of them never expected comfort. They hoped for enough food, healthy children, a decent harvest, a roof that stayed standing through the winter. Sometimes that was enough. As you settle into the quiet end of this story, perhaps you will notice your own surroundings. Maybe there is a soft pillow beneath your head. Maybe your room is warm. Maybe clean water is only a few steps away. Perhaps tomorrow morning you will wake to the sound of an alarm instead of a rooster that clearly has no respect for sleeping in. You might even complain that your coffee is not hot enough. That is perfectly fine. People have always complained. Only the reasons have changed. Thank you for wandering through this slow medieval morning with me. The fields are fading into the distance now. The church bell has gone quiet. The smoke drifts gently into the evening sky. The work is finally done, and unlike our medieval friends, you can simply close your eyes, stay warm, and rest. That may be one of the greatest comforts history has ever given us. Sleep well.